at me and tell me what you see. I look at you and tell you what I feel. Look at me and tell me what you see. I look at you and tell you what I feel.
Welcome back. This week we'll be delving into the notoriously abundant, and almost always crap, genre of the horror movie remake. And oh boy is it a classic. The Amityville Horror remake, starring Ryan Reynolds, who has quite a bit of history with me and this channel. But before I start clutching my face and shouting "fuck DC", let's start the movie. The film begins with the obligatory "based on a true story" byline, flashing back to November 13th, 1974, as Ronald DeFeo Jr. sits in his basement getting some kind of weird message from the TV.
Catch them. Kill them.
Although it should be noted that Ronald DeFeo Jr. never actually said he had any kind of supernatural experience before the original book of the story was published. But it's a minor inaccuracy compared to what's coming up next. So DeFeo goes through the house room to room, shooting every one of his family members in turn, which is pretty disturbing in itself. But it gets worse, as a young girl hears the gunshots and hides in her closet, only to be found immediately by DeFeo, and after a
I love you, Jody.
he shoots her in the head. Now, this is the really gross part, because in the original DeFeo murder case, Jody DeFeo never existed, but was made up for this film. Now, I ask you, doesn't it take a certain certifiable psychopath to look at the cold-blooded murder of 6 people, children included, and then to say, you know what, let's make this even more horrific? Not to mention the fact that DeFeo is still alive and could watch this. After the opening credits of news reports on the killings, we then shift to a year later, as we see George and Kathy Lutz, played by Ryan Reynolds and Melissa George, have some fun in bed.
George, what are you doing to my mom?
Nothing?
He sounded oddly defensive then, like he'd just been caught wanking. There's some father talk with the youngest boy Michael asking about his dad who died, and honestly the writing between the kids and Reynolds is pretty well done, as they all sit down for breakfast, setting up a nice contrast for when he goes cuckoo bananas later. Also, you might recognise the little girl. She's played by Chloe Grace Moretz, as in Hit Girl, in her first major movie role, but she's sadly nowhere near as foul-mouthed in this film. George and Kathy are out house hunting, with George insisting that everything in the neighbourhood is out of their price range. But of course, 412 Ocean Avenue is significantly reduced, and oddly, out in the middle of nowhere. First of all, they changed the name of the house from 112 to 412 Ocean Avenue out of respect for the family who live there today, who have reported zero spookiness, I might add. But also, I love the fact that the film had to put the house in a remote location so the events of the film can make any sort of sense. Whereas in reality, the house is situated around other houses in a normal neighbourhood. The Lutz meet with the realtor, who's looking understandably nervous as she starts the tour of the house, impressing the Lutz on its size and elegance. And being a contractor, George tells the realtor he's very sceptical of this deal of a lifetime. But the realtor pretty much ignores his scepticism.
The house was built in 1692, at least the basement. The rest of the house was added from that foundation. It's one of the oldest Dutch colonials in Long Island.
Interesting fact, the realtor mentions that the basement was made in 1692 and then the house was built on top of it. But a house that old wouldn't have a basement at all. At least not one that spans the entire footprint of the house like it does in the film. Also, the interior of the house is completely different in every way to how the house actually looks. In one of the rooms, they notice the boathouse outside, and while they're distracted, spooky things start happening in the house, making the realtor even more nervous than she already was. And to compound the situation, she then shows them the basement, where DeFeo spent most of his time, and of course, the realtor gets the Lutz to go down on their own, like a canary in a mineshaft. After the tour, George and Kathy discuss secretly whether they should buy the house, and George finally relents, agreeing to buy the place. But he bizarrely chooses now to ask what the catch is. Ideally, that would be my first question. The realtor tells them about the murders, but they just ignore it and agree to buy the place. Now, there is a law that states the realtor will not receive any disciplinary action if they fail to disclose a history of homicide on a property. However, that law was made in 1995, whereas the film takes place in 75. So, although not technically against the law, it's still pretty bad form for the realtor not to mention the murders without being prompted. The film then starts its countdown of the days, because the Lutz famously only lasted 28 days in the house. Why they needed to explicitly state the days, I'm not sure. Seems pretty arbitrary to me. Then there's a delightful montage of the family moving in, which is all captured on Super 8 for some extra goofy jackassery. Once everyone has settled in for the night, George and Kathy talk about the eldest son, Billy, being estranged from George. But they're interrupted when Kathy's mother calls, who clearly doesn't like George much.
Your mother's gotta stop gushing over me, seriously. It's embarrassing now.
Reynolds does bring his usual snarky persona to the film, which adds some levity. Once again, until he goes cuckoo bananas, that is. George complains about being cold, but Kathy doesn't feel it, so he goes down to the basement to check the house's heating, adding more wood to the fire. And while down there, he notices all of DeFeo's stuff, hearing strange noises from the air vents, not really paying any mind. The film's starting out pretty sedate in its spooky goings-on, and it could be considered mildly creepy in tone. But don't worry, the film's about to roundhouse kick subtlety in the fucking head. Just watch. That night, George and Kathy decide to christen the new house with some midnight sex. However, as the clock turns to 3:15, the time of the killings, the rutting is interrupted by this. Why was she hanging? That's not how she died. Seems needlessly grotesque. George isn't feeling so good the next morning after the hanging cockblock, and Kathy hears Hit Girl talking to someone in her room. She tells her mother she was talking to Jody, as we see the ghost of the child sitting there. Why the kid isn't disturbed by the whole gunshot to the head is beyond me. Kathy also notices an Etch-a-Sketch drawing asking if that's Jody, but the ghost warns her not to tell about the man Hit Girl refers to as an a-hole. It's nice to see that Chloe Moretz got an early education in swearing like a sailor. But also, speaking of Jody, in the original story, because that's what it is, a story, Jody is mentioned, but is referred to as some kind of demon-like pig creature. So yeah, I'm not too sure which is better, because both interpretations of Jody seem pretty ridiculous. Outside the house, George is chopping wood when Michael comes running with some kind of metal device, saying he found it in the basement, and then George gets creepy.
Not the basement. My office. You listen to me. You don't go down there. Understand?
Well, he started off early with the Cuckoo Bananas act. Kathy comes home with the groceries, saying she found a babysitter. However, things ramp up when she asks where her daughter is, but George doesn't know, so they run off to find her. They get to the open boathouse and find the girl standing on George's boat, almost in a trance, but quickly snapping out of it, saying that Jody wanted to see the boat. Kathy rightfully criticises George for not watching the girl, Chelsea, and they get out of the boathouse, with George locking the place, making sure we see to emphasise later spookiness. That night, Michael wakes up to some rumbling sounds as the walls shake, but don't worry, it's not George and Kathy having sex again. Michael needs to use the bathroom, asking Billy to go with him, but is told to go alone. He apprehensively walks down the corridor to the bathroom, and we see that the boathouse is open again. See, I told ya. Spookiness. And in the bathroom, Michael relieves himself. And don't you just hate it when you're in a public bathroom and somebody stands next to you and you just can't go? Okay, I'll give you that one, Amityville remake. That was somewhat unsettling. Although I think it was made worse by the downright pervy look the ghost had. He was drooling and everything. And once Michael is back in bed, the windows of the house open, chairs move about, and George is awoken to the sound of gunshots. He investigates and finds himself standing over the shot boys, as he blows his own brains out. But don't worry, it was just a dream. However, the nightmare isn't over as George looks out the window to see the boathouse open as Chelsea's balloon floats out the door. So George runs out thinking she's in there again, in full washboard abs mode. Cause you know, a contractor who does zero weight training would have a body like that. In the boathouse, George sees bubbles come from under the water, jumping in to look for Chelsea, but doesn't find anything. Getting back to the house, he finds the dog barking at something, and George sees the ghost of Jodie looking at him through one of the attic windows, before both Jodie and Chelsea look at him. Gotta get use out of those creepy little girl skills. I guess it gets creepier the more of them there are. George gets to the attic, but finds that everything is as it should be. Yeah, except for that, which again is just weird and another scare meant for the audience only, which if you've seen my Ghost Ship review, you know I hate that shit. The next morning he's in the basement finding the dog scratching at the wall. George shouts at the dog angrily, again emphasizing his change in persona, and Kathy finds him sitting alone in the basement looking at the hole in the wall. He tells Kathy about the boathouse and finding the dog outside, and not only that, but George found the keys to the boathouse in Billy's room. So, are the ghosts trying to trick him into thinking his family is against him, or are they just making him do psychotic things? Cause if they can get him to do stuff, I don't know why they would need to make him paranoid. Plus, if their goal is to get George to kill his family, then surely it's in their best interests to not make him seem suspicious. Ghosts work in mysterious ways, I suppose. The film then skips ahead to day 15, which, seeing the way George was after only 1 or 2 days, logically he should be painting the walls in his own blood by now. While George and Billy get wood for the house's fire, the fridge magnets spell out "catch 'em and kill 'em." I guess being dead doesn't improve your grammar. And then... yeah, I'm already sick of the shocking musical stings in this film. Kathy notices the magnets calling for George, but he's back in the kitchen drinking milk and the magnets are back to normal. Because that was scary, I guess? That night, George looks pretty fucked up and hearing strange sounds, yet he and Kathy are going out for the night. They wait for the babysitter, but Billy is reluctant to let her into the house, thinking he's old enough to stay on his own. Well, that is until he sees her.
You sure you don't want a babysitter?
That would have probably been funnier without the horribly bloodshot eyes. The babysitter mentions she used to sit for the DeFeo family, making Kathy and George feel apprehensive. But then they just leave without a word. You know, the regular procedure for trusting your kids with a babysitter. George and Kathy are out to dinner at a restaurant with the generic as fuck name of Italian Kitchen. I guess there's no question of what food they serve. Chinese food. At the table, George mentions that he's feeling and looking a lot better since getting out of the house. Which you would think would make them consider some kind of correlation, even if it's just an allergic reaction to something. But no, it's just one of those things that needs to be ignored to continue the plot. And back at the house, the babysitter, Anita Bong hit here, is smoking some weed, cause she's a really shitty babysitter. And Billy is crushing on her, giving her popcorn, which I'm sure will help with the munchies. Returning to dinner, there's some exchanges of heartfelt emotions, getting them both teary-eyed, counterbalanced by the babysitter sticking her tongue out and fantasizing about Gene Simmons' tongue. She also then creepily asks the boy if he French kisses. And to continue her terrible babysitting, she then tells them what happened to the DeFeo family. But before she gets to the grisly details, Michael comes in. She doesn't get him to leave or anything, just gets Michael to cover his ears, before saying,
"A rifle. Back, 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 back!" He went room to room, splattering their heads as they slept.
yeah, that's some responsible babysitting right there. I'm sure the little kid didn't hear any of that. And she goes further to tell them that the DeFeo boys were killed in that very room, freaking out everyone. But don't worry, she's not done yet, taking them to where Jodie DeFeo was found dead at the beginning in the closet. Chelsea comes in, talking about Jodie like she's still alive, and then, in another boneheaded move, Billy dares the babysitter to go in the closet, which she's fine about doing. That is until she sees a teddy bear that she recognises, and the door slams shut. At first thinking that it's a prank, but the door won't open, and that's when Jodie appears, showing off her gunshot wound. But even worse than that, she does this. Why the fuck did she do that exactly? I mean, I hate it too when I have an itch I just can't reach to scratch, but that was just weird. The babysitter then sees Jodie's dead body and starts screaming, banging her hands on the door, which the actress actually did for 2 days straight, so some kudos there, I reckon. She is then being wheeled into an ambulance when George and Kathy return home, and the babysitter is quite mad, babbling about dead Jodie. Kathy tries to get answers, but it's useless. And inside, George is being his charming self, telling the boys to shut up, when even Kathy can see he's going overboard. The boys say the house is bad, but George obviously ignores them, and then they mention the DeFeos.
2 little boys died in our room.
Goddamn babysitter's an idiot.
Right you are, George, and probably even more of an idiot than you realise too. The boys refuse to sleep in their room, but George insists.
Wipe that stupid look off your face and go to bed. Run.
You know, this isn't normal behaviour. Even if you don't believe in the paranormal, it's a huge personality change. Kathy really should be doing something other than acting angry at George. Kathy speaks with Chelsea to get some answers on what happened, but Chelsea just says that Jodie did it. And then she mentions the bad man who also lives there, giving the audience her most serious face, so we know he's really bad. The next day, George is cutting wood, getting Billy to help, and he's shirtless for the women in the audience, obviously. And George has Billy stacking wood until it's dark outside. And at dinner, George acts like the school jackass, spitting out his food and disrespecting Kathy's deceased husband. So, first comes acting like a bit of a dick, then comes the killing? Okay. In the basement, George does some refurbishment when he hears the children talking, but that gets interrupted by a spooky voice. I know we're going to get an explanation for why that phrase is said, but it doesn't make it any less stupid sounding. George follows the voice to the hole in the boards he found, and placing his hand on the wall suddenly transports him to a weird torture room.
Kill them!
Yeah, that was pretty much the last of the film's subtlety gone in a flash. I think the only thing left is for Ryan Reynolds to play improvised xylophone jazz on his own spinal cord. And after his glimpse of death, George isn't feeling very well at all, so he runs himself a bath, but that doesn't go well either. See, that was far more unsettling than the other scare moment. Don't get me wrong, it was still subtle as a sledgehammer, but not as bad. Kathy takes George to the hospital, which is actually a pretty logical thing to do. They run tests, yet don't find anything wrong with him, and George says he's feeling fine again due to being out of the house. But the doctor does tell him to see a psychiatrist. George and Kathy leave the hospital. Surprisingly, he's allowed to drive. And while they do, Billy is giving the kids breakfast, but Chelsea goes off to get her teddy bear, and outside, that's when Chelsea's bear drops in front of George, and Kathy sees that she somehow managed to get on top of the roof of the house, but isn't bothered by it at all. Yeah, I really hope George kept that number for the shrink. Kathy runs up to get Chelsea while George sets up a ladder to climb after her. Kathy gets on the roof, but the ladder falls from beneath George, so now there's 2 people in peril. Kathy asks what Chelsea is doing up there, and she just says that she has to go with Jodie, and surprisingly, she does actually jump. But fortunately, Kathy manages to grab her, slipping down the roof, but as Chelsea's shirt rips, she falls, getting grabbed by George, saving the day. Again, I'm not too sure what the ghosts were trying to accomplish there. I mean, maybe I'm mistaken into thinking they're working to some kind of goal, but if they want George to kill the family, why would they then also try to kill them themselves? It just seems pretty nonsensical to me. Kathy shouts at Chelsea for doing such a stupid thing, and then they argue about whether Jodie is real or not. Chelsea says she's seen her, and that she was going to take her to see her father. And of course, George has to give his 2 cents.
What's the matter with you people? Wacko family.
He's been in the house, what, 5 minutes? yet he's already going mental again. These ghosts don't waste time. And now he's set up in the basement. Kathy, unsure of what else to do, has now gone to speak with the local priest, telling him that there's something evil in the house, admitting it sounds crazy, but the priest tells her that the DeFeos had a similar problem. And back at the house, George is being an abusive arsehole, getting Billy to hold the wood while he chops. Yeah, he's clearly gone full-on psycho now. And in the basement, he watches the film that was recorded at the beginning, finding a strange new addition. Again, the ghosts don't seem to have any kind of defined plan here. They're just throwing shit and seeing what sticks. Either make George paranoid, or just control him. And that night at 3:15 again, George wakes up and wanders around the house, finding the windows and door open. He hears the dog barking and picks up an axe, which I would question why, but he's nuts. It doesn't need explanation. George gets to the boathouse hearing the dog inside. He investigates as we see something under the water, and then something attacks. Yes, it turns out he killed the dog. See, now that was actually a pretty effective and clever scene, showing how the ghost can manipulate what George sees and hears. Of course, it's a bit too subtle for this film now it's gone past the point of no return. But credit where credit's due. George cleans up the blood, and in the morning, while looking at his hands, Kathy comes in and tells him that they should just leave. But despite killing the dog, he doesn't want to walk away from the house, acting again like an abusive arsehole, swearing at Kathy, saying she wanted the house, so now she's got it. Kathy seems to have wised up to the evil house, but why hasn't she seen that George is a fucking nutcase because of the house? It can't be that hard to put 2 and 2 together, surely. She's had like 20 days of this by now, for God's sake. The arguing is cut short when one of the boys comes in to say that the dog has gone missing, which George makes sure and puts on his most nonchalant face for. But now is the time for a good old exorcism, as the priest has arrived to perform the ritual. And while he does, George is busying himself by nailing all the windows shut. You know, as you do. Kathy greets the priest at the door, and the priest recognises the teddy bear that Chelsea's holding. And while walking with Kathy, the priest explains that the bear belonged to Jody, and explains what happened to it.
Jody DeFeo was buried with that dog.
Was the really cheesy sudden zoom that necessary? 'Cause it looked ridiculous. The priest gets all his equipment and starts the ritual, and yeah, it's as over the top as you'd expect from this film, as the holy water boils on the floors and walls it lands on. Then the door slams shut. An upside down cross? Really? Somebody didn't plan that out very well, did they? However, that specific doorknob was part of the house that was used to film in, so can't really blame the film on this one. The priest hears something coming from the air vent and goes to investigate, but when he does, a swarm of flies bursts out, attacking. And then the stereotypical... because this ghost likes using the classics. Kathy runs out after the priest, who drives off without any explanation, and once gone, Kathy runs into a bloodshot George to end the spooky scene. I mentioned this before, but that sequence really was straight out of the classic haunting handbook. Granted, the original movie and book practically wrote the rules on haunted houses, but you'd think the remake wouldn't make that mistake, because I think the boat has sailed on this being an historical account. Oh, and later, we find out that the house was built on an ancient Indian site. That old chestnut. Which was also in the book, but was also thoroughly debunked by Native American leaders. And that night, the ghosts are stepping up their game as the windows and doors open again. George can't sleep because of the barking dog, but then realises that doesn't make much sense. The TV suddenly turns on with the ominous voice telling George to catch him and kill him, and outside the house, George has a breakdown, screaming at the boathouse and collapsing, which you could argue is him trying to resist the house's influence. We then shift to day 28, the last day. Ooh, spooky. Kathy wakes up alone and George wakes up vomiting, so things aren't going well. Kathy decides to investigate the town's records on the house, first finding all about the killings, and she sees that DeFeo wrote what she saw on the fridge. Back in the house, George finally decides to find out what's behind the wall he's obsessed with, breaking open the boards, finding it quite gooey and maggoty. The benefits of a decent house surveyor right there. Returning to Kathy, she finds the explanation for the bad grammar. Turns out the ghosts weren't giving an instruction, they were saying a name. The name of one Jeremiah Ketchum, who is the man who built the house as a sanatorium. We then flip back and forth between Kathy finding out all the horrible stuff Ketchum did to people, and George who is experiencing it firsthand, as he sees the ghosts of Native American people Ketchum tortured and killed. But there's something else, as Kathy reads that Ketchum killed himself, so his presence would be in the house forever. And George finds Ketchum watching him slit his own throat, spraying George with copious amounts of blood. Now, I understand wanting to live forever, but why Amityville, New York? No offense to the state, but there surely must be better places than that. But I guess it's less why and why not. Also, the room George found is the infamous red room the real George Lust supposedly found in the basement, which doesn't actually exist in the house. The movie gets around this little fact by it being a weird hallucinatory experience for George. Kathy goes to the priest to tell him all she found and to ask why he abandoned them like that. He admits that the house scares him and that DeFeo came to him talking about the same things a few days before the murders, and finishes by saying that Kathy and her family need to leave immediately. And wouldn't you know, as soon as Kathy becomes determined to get out of the house, George has gone full-on nutcase, as he pulls the phone off the wall after Kathy tells him to get out of the house. Although there is more than one phone in that house, so that didn't really accomplish anything. Might as well just hang up, George. Kathy returns to the house with it now pouring with stereotypical rain, thunder and lightning, and she wants to know where George is. Billy tells her he's in the boathouse, as we see him looking for something in the water. Not sure why though. But he does find one of the ghosts from the basement down there, so he turns on the engine, I guess to blend him up. But that's when Kathy comes into the boathouse and George's light blinds her suddenly, causing her to fall into the water and for her hair to get caught in the rotor of the boat. George sees her face as something monstrous, so he turns the rotor trying to drown Kathy. But he comes to his senses in the nick of time, releasing her as she runs off afraid of him. Kathy gets back in the house to find Chelsea in the basement, and then she sees the extent of George's madness, as he has built individual coffins for all the family. So if his intentions or thoughts weren't clear before, they sure as shit are now. Kathy obviously doesn't quickly get the hell out of there, so George appears, scaring the shit out of her, picking up Chelsea in a pretty threatening way. But Kathy manages to get him to hand her over, and then they run like hell, while George shouts after her. She gets up the stairs shouting for the kids, and George has got his shotgun for his climactic stalking killer act. Billy blocks the door to the basement, but then the doors and windows to the house lock on the family. George breaks out of the basement, grabbing Kathy and throwing her about, but Billy gets him off her and they manage to run upstairs, with George and shotgun in tow. He uses the shotgun key to open the attic door and can hear Kathy and the kids on the roof, which he shoots through, thankfully missing. He climbs after them, but Billy manages to dislodge a pipe and knock him off the roof and seemingly unconscious. But as Kathy sees Ketchum in the window, George wakes up, grabbing his trusty axe. One thing that's part of the original story is that the last night the Lutz stayed in the house, they never actually talked about, describing it as too frightening, which naturally the film takes as carte blanche to just make up whatever they want that happened. But there's no evidence to suggest that George actually went mental. George catches up with the family and holds Billy against the wall with the axe, seeing his face change into a monster. George looks set to kill him, but Kathy holds her husband at shotgun point. He aims the barrel square between his eyes, goading Kathy to shoot, but she can't. And as George goes to kill Billy, Kathy knocks him out with the butt of the shotgun. He gets flashes of the family, but then he's suddenly awake and straight up axes Kathy in the gut. Which is one hell of a massive departure from the original story, because Kathy Lutz didn't die. Oh wait, no, it was a dream vision thing. Because fake-outs like that work best when there's less than a minute left in the film and are so short to be completely inconsequential. George snaps out of it long enough to tell Kathy to kill him or he'll kill all of them, but she just knocks him out good and proper and they drag him into the boathouse. And while trying to get George into the boat, he suddenly starts spasming and gets the most psychotic epileptic fit of his life, seeing a load of fucked up imagery. But once it's over, his eyes have gone back to normal and he's compliant, so you could argue that was the ghosts being leached from his system. And the film ends with them all driving away from the house on the boat, George seeming to be completely fine now. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't ever trust a man who tried to kill me. And then there's of course some ending text, because the film still thinks it's factually credible, describing what we just saw, because we have a zero attention span, I guess. But wait, there's more, as there needs to be more tragedy. With Jodie standing in the house, she then screams and freaks out, with everything reverting back to the way it was, and then Jodie is pulled through the floor, implying she's trapped there forever. How pleasant. Also, with the house reverting back to normal, it neatly explains why nothing that happened to the house in the Lutz's account was actually evident upon inspection of the place. So, I see what you did there, movie. The Amityville Horror remake is a strange film. On one hand, it portrays itself as a reenactment of a factual event, and on the other, wants to be the bloodiest, gore-filled, schlocky fright fest possible, which doesn't really make much sense. And yeah, this film is surprisingly bloody, considering the original story and film had no blood whatsoever. At least I don't think so. However, considering all that, I would still say that this isn't a terrible film. It's stupid, it's over the top, but it can be entertaining, as Ryan Reynolds and Melissa George act incredibly well in it, so I do concede that. But if you need any more examples of this film's inaccuracies, George Lutz himself denounced the film as drivel. So yeah, quite possibly the person who I consider one of the world's greatest bullshitters called this film bullshit. I think that says more than any review. Also, George Lutz was in the process of suing the filmmakers for defamation of character when he died in 2006. But I'm not going to make a joke about that. So yeah, that was the Amityville Horror remake. And you know what? It's put me in the mood for remakes. So let's look at another one. But I won't be anywhere near as generous as I was with this film. So until then, see you next time.
With the well-timed lightning.